Consider, for a moment, the year 610 in the Common Era. The world's great empires are dying, not quickly, not dramatically, but through exhaustion, like ancient trees that have stood too long against relentless storms. In Constantinople, the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius surveys an empire bled white by decades of war. His treasury is empty, his armies are scattered. To the east, the Persian Sassanid Empire mirrors his predicament exactly. These two giants have been locked in combat for generations, throwing armies at each other across Mesopotamia and the Levantine coast, each victory Pyrrhic, each defeat recoverable only at devastating cost. They have fought themselves into a stalemate that benefits neither a mutual destruction that has created something unexpected, a vacuum, a space where power might flow to those clever enough to seize it. Between these exhausted empires lies the Arabian Peninsula, a land most civilized powers considered peripheral, useful only for its incense and its trade routes. The Romans called it Arabia Felix and Arabia Deserta, the fortunate and the barren, acknowledging its extremes but never quite understanding its people. Here, in cities scattered along ancient caravan routes, in oasis towns where date palms provide the only shade, live tribes who have perfected the art of survival in one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. These are not simple nomads. They are sophisticated traders, poets who memorize thousands of verses, warriors whose mobility makes them formidable, and keepers of intricate social codes that govern everything from water rights to blood feuds. They worship at the Kaaba in Mecca, a cube-shaped shrine that houses hundreds of idols, a physical representation of their fragmentation. Each tribe has its gods, its customs, its fierce independence, yet something remarkable is stirring in Mecca. A merchant named Muhammad ibn Abdullah has begun to speak of visions, of a single God, of a message that will unite not just Arabia, but the world beyond. He is 40 years old, an age when men in his society are established, known, their character proven. His reputation for honesty has earned him the title Al-Amin, the trustworthy one. When he speaks of revelations received in a cave on Mount Hira, some listen not because the message is easy to accept, but because the messenger cannot be easily dismissed. The timing is extraordinary. Had Muhammad appeared a century earlier, during the height of Byzantine and Persian power, his message might have been crushed between empires that tolerated no challenges to their authority. Had he emerged a century later, the geopolitical landscape would have shifted in unpredictable ways. But in this moment, this precise window of opportunity, the great powers are too weakened to intervene in Arabian affairs, too focused on their mutual destruction to notice what is building in the desert. Consider what Muhammad offers to the fractured tribes of Arabia. Unity, yes, but unity built on something more durable than temporary alliances or tribal honor. He proposes a community, an ummah, bound not by blood, but by belief. In a society where your identity comes from your clan, where protection depends on your family's strength, this is revolutionary. It suggests that a freed slave and a wealthy merchant might call each other brother, that old tribal feuds might be set aside in favor of a higher loyalty. The established powers in Mecca recognize the threat immediately. The Quraysh tribe controls the Kaaba, profits from the pilgrim trade, maintains the delicate balance of tribal politics that keeps Mecca prosperous. Muhammad's monotheism threatens their gods, certainly, but more dangerously, it threatens their political and economic system. They respond with persecution, with economic boycott, with violence. But Muhammad proves to be more than a visionary. He is a strategist of remarkable sophistication. When persecution becomes unbearable, he does something unexpected. Rather than fighting a battle he cannot win, rather than compromising his message, he looks north to Yathrib, a city torn apart by tribal warfare, desperately in need of a neutral arbiter who might bring peace. The city will later be known as Medina, the city of the Prophet. Here, Muhammad transforms from persecuted preacher to statesman, from religious leader to political architect. The Constitution of Medina, one of history's most overlooked documents, reveals the depth of his strategic thinking. It creates a confederation of tribes, Muslim and non-Muslim, under a common system of law and mutual defense. Jews are included as full members of the community, free to practice their faith. Tribal customs are respected where they don't contradict the new religious principles. It is pragmatic, flexible, brilliant, a framework that acknowledges reality while moving toward an ideal. Watch how carefully Muhammad builds his power base. He forms alliances through marriage, connecting his family to influential clans. He leads raids against Meccan caravans, not merely for plunder, though the economic dimension is crucial, but to demonstrate power and attract followers. Success breeds success. As his forces prove themselves against Mecca's superior numbers through victories at Badr, each triumph brings new tribes into the fold. But notice his treatment of defeated enemies. After early battles, he often releases prisoners, sometimes without ransom. He makes treaties that seem generous to the point of weakness, then uses the peace to consolidate power. When he finally marches on Mecca with 10,000 followers, the city that persecuted him for years, he could demand vengeance. Instead, he offers general amnesty. The Kaaba is cleansed of idols, but its sanctity is maintained. Mecca's elite are won over rather than destroyed. This is not merely mercy, though mercy is present. It is calculated magnificence. Muhammad understands that he is not building a cult of personality that dies with its founder, but a movement that must outlive him. Destroyed enemies become martyrs or fuel for future rebellions. Converted enemies become administrators, generals, traders who spread the faith and the political system that carries it. Consider the economic genius underlying this religious movement. Islam forbids usury but encourages trade. It mandates charity zakat that redistributes wealth while building social cohesion. It creates clear rules for contracts and inheritance that make commerce more predictable across tribal boundaries. For merchants like Muhammad himself, these are not abstract theological points. They are the infrastructure of a new economic order, one that will make the Islamic world the center of global trade for centuries. By the time Muhammad dies in the year 632, Arabia is unified for the first time in its history. A network of alliances and conversions stretches across the peninsula. An administrative system is developing to manage this growing community. And perhaps most importantly, a cadre of leaders has been trained men who have learned both the spiritual message and the practical politics necessary to spread it. The Byzantine and Persian empires, still weakened from their long war, barely notice what has happened in Arabia. They see tribal politics, perhaps a new trade confederation, nothing that threatens their millennia-old dominance. They are catastrophically wrong. What Muhammad has created is not merely a religion, though it is genuinely that, not merely a political movement, though it functions as one, not merely an economic network, though trade will be its lifeblood. He has created a synthesis, a system where faith, politics, law, and commerce reinforce each other in ways that make the whole far more powerful than any of its parts. The Arabian Peninsula in 632 is like a bow drawn to its fullest extent, the arrow notched, and aimed at the exhausted empires to the north and east. The potential energy accumulated through decades of unification, organization, and religious fervor is about to convert into kinetic force. Within a century, Muslim armies will stand in Spain and at the borders of China. The Byzantine Empire will be reduced to Anatolia and the Balkans. The Persian Empire will cease to exist entirely, its territory absorbed into a new Islamic realm. Cities that had stood for millennia under Greek, Roman, or Persian rule will open their gates to Arab generals riding out of the desert. But this explosion is not chaos. It is not a barbarian invasion sweeping away civilization. The expansion to come will be remarkably organized, strategically brilliant, and in many ways welcomed by the conquered peoples themselves. To understand how this happens, we must follow the Muslim armies north, watch them exploit every weakness in their enemies' defences, and discover why subjects of the Byzantine and Persian empires so often preferred their new Muslim rulers. The stage is set. The actors have taken their positions. The great empires of late antiquity are about to discover that power, once lost, is rarely reclaimed. That weakness invites intervention. That a new idea, combined with military skill and strategic genius, can reshape the world in a single lifetime. The story of Islam's rise is the story of perfect timing, meeting extraordinary leadership, of opportunity recognized and ruthlessly exploited, of a merchant who became a prophet who became a statesman, and a statesman who changed the course of human history. What happens next will determine the shape of 3 continents for the next 1,000 years. The year is 636. Just 4 years after Muhammad's death, a Muslim army under Khalid ibn al-Walid, a general whose tactical genius rivals any in history, faces a Byzantine force near the Yarmouk River. The Byzantines outnumber the Muslims perhaps 2 to 1. They have superior armor, better supply lines, the weight of imperial tradition. By every conventional measure, they should win. They are annihilated. The Battle of Yarmouk is not an accident. It is the culmination of careful planning, brilliant reconnaissance, and an understanding of the enemy's weaknesses that borders on clairvoyance. Khalid has positioned his forces with the river and ravines at the Byzantines' back, limiting their ability to retreat or maneuver. He has timed his attack for late summer when the desert wind, the deadly simoom, blows sand into the faces of the Byzantine troops. He has placed his best cavalry exactly where they can exploit the inevitable gaps in the enemy formation. But the true brilliance lies in what happened before the battle. Muslim scouts have spent weeks mapping every water source, every defensible position, every route the Byzantines might use. They have interviewed local populations about Byzantine morale, supply problems, or internal conflicts. They have turned the desert itself into an intelligence network. This is not the warfare of passionate zealots throwing themselves at superior forces. This is systematic, professional, calculated military excellence combined with religious motivation. The combination proves unstoppable. Consider what the Muslim armies offer to the populations they conquer. For the Christian and Jewish farmers of Syria and Egypt, Byzantine rule means heavy taxation to fund constant wars, forced conscription of sons who die in distant battles, religious persecution if they hold the wrong interpretation of Christian doctrine. The theological disputes that obsess Constantinople, the nature of Christ, the relationship of the Trinity, matter little to peasants struggling to survive. Yet these disputes have led to imprisonment and execution of those deemed heretics. The Muslim generals arrive with a proposition: accept Muslim political authority, pay the jizya tax instead of Byzantine. Taxes, keep your religion, keep your property, keep your local administration. For many, this is not a terrible bargain. The jizya is often lower than Byzantine taxation. Muslim rule promises stability after decades of war. And critically, the new rulers show no interest in theological disputes among Christians. They are, after all people of the book, from the Islamic perspective. Damascus opens its gates through negotiation rather than siege. Alexandria, greatest city of the Eastern Mediterranean, surrenders partly through military pressure, but also through the calculation of its Christian population that Muslim rule might be preferable to Byzantine orthodoxy. City after city makes the same assessment. This is conquest, certainly, but it is conquest that understands the value of voluntary submission over forced subjugation. The Muslims are building an empire, and empires require administration, tax collection, trade networks. Dead populations pay no taxes. Rebellious provinces drain resources. But willing subjects, allowed to keep their faiths and customs under a new political authority, can make their conquerors rich. Watch how the Muslim commanders handle their victories. In conquered cities, they typically leave the existing administrative structure largely intact. Local officials who switch their loyalty from Byzantine or Persian authority to the new Muslim governors often keep their positions. Tax collection systems are adapted, not destroyed. Courts continue to function, applying local law to non-Muslims while gradually developing Islamic law for the Muslim community. The economic incentives are remarkable. For the Arab warriors flooding out of the peninsula, conquest brings wealth beyond imagination. The treasury of the Persian Empire, centuries of accumulated gold and silver, falls into Muslim hands. The rich farmlands of Iraq and Egypt now pay tribute to Medina and later Damascus. Veterans of the early campaigns receive pensions from this conquered wealth. New recruits join for religious reasons, certainly, but also for the very practical prospect of land, loot, and lifetime income. Yet the system is designed to sustain itself beyond the initial generation. The conquered peoples are not enslaved en masse or expelled. They are integrated into a new political order where conversion to Islam brings full membership in the ruling community, while remaining Christian or Jewish means protected but subordinate status. This creates a dynamic. Some convert for genuine faith, some for social advancement, some for economic opportunity. Over generations, the Muslim population of conquered territories grows not primarily through Arab immigration, but through local conversion. The Persian Empire provides a perfect case study in strategic conquest. The Sassanid rulers have governed for 4 centuries, creating a sophisticated bureaucracy, a complex class system, and a state religion, Zoroastrianism, that permeates every aspect of government. Yet their empire is hollowed out by the same wars that weakened Byzantium, by internal power struggles, by religious minorities seeking any alternative to Zoroastrian dominance. When Muslim armies cross into Iraq, they find Persian forces led by commanders who distrust each other, an emperor who has only recently seized power, and a population that includes Christians, Jews, and dissident Zoroastrians, all chafing under official persecution. The Muslims do not merely invade, they offer alliance to disaffected groups, promise religious tolerance, demonstrate through early battles that Persian military dominance is ending. The Battle of Qadisiyah in 637 sees a smaller Muslim force defeat the main Persian army through superior tactics and the defection of Persian subject peoples who see the writing on the wall. 3 years later, the Battle of Nihawand destroys the last organized Persian resistance. The Emperor Yazdegerd flees east, seeking help that never comes, until he is murdered by his own subjects in 651. A 400-year-old empire has been erased in 15 years. Its territory, its wealth, its administrative systems all flow into the expanding Islamic realm. But notice what the Muslims preserve. The Persian bureaucratic tradition, particularly the divan system of government departments, is adopted wholesale. Persian administrators who accept Muslim authority continue to run provinces, collect taxes, maintain roads. The ancient city of Ctesiphon is looted, but its structures studied, its methods incorporated. This is conquest as acquisition, not destruction. The Muslims are building something that must last, and lasting empires are built on administrative competence, not just military victory. The military innovations themselves deserve attention. Arab cavalry tactics, developed in raids and tribal warfare, proved devastatingly effective against the rigid formations of Byzantine and Persian armies. The Muslims perfect the feigned retreat, drawing enemy forces into vulnerable positions before turning to attack. They use speed and mobility to concentrate forces at decisive points, often appearing where enemies thought the desert made movement impossible. Intelligence networks become a sophisticated art. The Barid, the postal service established across the growing empire, doubles as an espionage system. Governors send regular reports to the Caliph not just on tax collection, but on troop movements, local sentiment, potential threats. Merchants traveling the trade routes carry information along with goods. The Muslims know what is happening in their empire, and often in neighboring territories, with a speed and accuracy that their enemies cannot match. Consider the conquest of North Africa, a campaign that takes decades and demonstrates both the persistence and adaptability of Muslim strategy. The Berber tribes of the Maghreb have resisted Roman rule, Byzantine rule, and Vandal invasions. They are superb warriors in their own territory, masters of the terrain, fiercely independent. Initial Muslim invasions in the 640s achieved little permanent success. So, the Muslims change tactics. Instead of pure military conquest, they begin forming alliances with Berber tribes, offering them a share in the conquest of Spain and Sicily. Berber converts to Islam, become generals in Muslim armies. The Islamic message of equality among believers appeals to peoples who have been treated as inferiors by European powers. By the early 700s, much of North Africa is under Muslim political control, but Berber culture, language, and social structures remain intact. This flexibility, this willingness to adapt the conquest strategy to local conditions, is crucial to understanding Islamic expansion. In Persia, the Muslims adopt Persian administrative methods. In Egypt, they preserve Coptic officials and farming systems. In Syria, they maintain Byzantine urban structures. The empire grows not through imposing a uniform system, but through creating a framework flexible enough to accommodate enormous diversity. The economic dimension of conquest often receives less attention than the military, yet it is equally important. Every conquered territory brings new resources: Egyptian grain, Persian silver, Syrian olive oil, Iraqi dates. Trade routes that once terminated at hostile borders now flow uninterrupted across the Islamic realm. A merchant can travel from Spain to Central Asia under a single legal system, using the same currency, confident that contracts written in Cordoba will be honored in Samarkand. This economic integration makes the empire richer than the sum of its parts. Goods from China flow through Central Asian cities now controlled by Muslims, across Persian territories to Mediterranean ports. African gold moves north through Muslim-controlled Saharan trade routes. The Caliph in Damascus receives tax revenue from territories that span 3 continents, funding armies, building projects, and the administrative apparatus that keeps the empire functioning. The jizya tax system proves particularly ingenious. Non-Muslims pay this poll tax in exchange for protection and exemption from military service. It creates revenue streams that make diversity profitable rather than problematic. A province full of Christian or Jewish taxpayers is an economic asset. This aligns the empire's financial interests with religious tolerance, making persecution not just morally questionable but economically stupid. Yet we must not romanticize this system. It is tolerance born of pragmatism more than principle. Non-Muslims are second-class subjects with restricted rights. Forced conversions are rare, but social pressure to convert is constant. Muslim rulers are practical enough to preserve non-Muslim populations for economic reasons, but the system is built to encourage gradual conversion through economic and social incentives. By the year 750, when the Abbasid dynasty replaces the Umayyads in a bloody revolution, the Islamic Empire stretches from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indus River. It encompasses territories that were Greek, Roman, Persian, Egyptian, Berber, and Gothic. Millions of people who knew nothing of Arabia a century before now live under Muslim political authority. This transformation, this creation of a world-spanning empire in barely a century, is unprecedented in human history. Alexander the Great conquered quickly, but his empire fragmented immediately. The Romans built their empire over centuries of grinding warfare. The Muslims have matched Rome's extent in a fraction of the time. The secret lies not in any single factor but in the synthesis. military excellence combined with strategic intelligence, religious motivation combined with economic incentives, flexibility in administration combined with firm political control, the willingness to adopt useful practices from conquered peoples combined with confidence in Islamic political and legal frameworks. The conquered territories have not simply changed rulers, they are being integrated into a new civilization that is neither purely Arab nor simply a continuation of Byzantine or Persian traditions. It is something new, a cosmopolitan Islamic culture that will, in the coming centuries, make discoveries that change the world, preserve knowledge that Europe has lost, and create wealth on a scale that makes the early Muslim conquerors look like paupers. But empire is easy to conquer, hard to govern. The armies that swept across 3 continents in a century now face a different challenge: how to administer territories more diverse than any previous empire, how to balance competing interests and factions, how to maintain unity in a realm that speaks dozens of languages and follows varying interpretations of Islam itself. The next great test will not be fought on battlefields, but in administrative offices, tax collection, legal courts, and the delicate balance between religious authority and political power. The Muslims are about to discover that conquering the world is the easy part. Imagine the challenge. You control territory from the Pyrenees to the Pamirs, from the shores of the Atlantic to the borders of China. Your subjects speak Arabic, Persian, Greek, Coptic, Berber, Aramaic, and a dozen other languages. They follow Islam, Christianity in its various forms, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, and local faiths. They live as desert nomads, settled farmers, mountain herders, and urban merchants. The distance from your western to eastern frontier is greater than the width of the Roman Empire at its height. How do you govern this? The early caliphs, ruling from Medina and then Damascus, faced this question with increasing urgency. Conquest is exhilarating, administration is exhausting, yet without effective governance, the empire will fragment as quickly as it formed. The Muslims must invent, borrow, and adapt systems that can handle unprecedented complexity. They succeed brilliantly. Begin with the most fundamental question. How do you collect taxes from millions of people spread across 3 continents? The Umayyad and later Abbasid caliphs create a bureaucratic system that rivals and in some ways exceeds anything Rome or Persia achieved. At its heart is the Divan borrowed from Persian tradition, but expanded far beyond its origins. The Divan al-Kharaj manages land tax collection. Officials in every province maintain detailed records of agricultural land, its productivity, irrigation systems, and ownership. Tax rates vary based on soil quality, crop types, and local conditions. This is not crude extraction but sophisticated assessment. A dried-up irrigation canal means reduced taxes. A locust plague triggers tax relief. The system is designed to be sustainable, to keep farmers productive year after year, rather than squeezing them until they flee or rebel. The Divan al-Jund handles military administration and payroll. Every soldier in the empire is registered, with records of service, rank, and pension entitlements. Veterans receive lifetime payments from the treasury. This transforms the army from a raiding force into a professional military with long-term incentives to maintain the empire. A soldier knows that faithful service means security for his family, even after he can no longer fight. The Barid, the postal service, becomes the nervous system of the empire. Relay stations every 12 miles allow messages to travel at speeds that will not be matched until the telegraph. The Caliph in Baghdad can receive news from the Spanish frontier in weeks rather than months. Governors send regular reports. Intelligence flows constantly. But the Barid is also a control mechanism. Postal inspectors observe local officials, report on their conduct, watch for corruption or disloyalty. Consider the genius of this communication. A network. It turns vast distance from a vulnerability into manageable challenge. Provincial governors cannot easily rebel when the capital knows what they are doing almost as quickly as their own subjects do. Merchants use the postal roads, making them more profitable and ensuring local populations support their maintenance. Information becomes power, and the caliphs monopolize information. The monetary system reveals equal sophistication. The early caliphs inherit a chaotic mix of Byzantine gold coins, Persian silver dirhams, and local currencies. The Caliph Abd al-Malik, in the 690s, creates a unified Islamic coinage, the gold dinar and silver dirham. These coins circulate from Spain to Central Asia, their weight and purity guaranteed by the Caliph's authority. This is more than convenience. Unified currency makes trade predictable, allows merchants to calculate profits across vast distances, and symbolizes the empire's unity. A coin minted in Damascus is accepted in Samarkand, not because of the metal's value alone, but because of trust in the Islamic monetary system. That trust rests on centuries of maintained standards, on punishment for counterfeiters, on the empire's economic might. But the most remarkable administrative innovation may be the Waqf system, religious endowments that fund public services while operating outside direct government control. A wealthy individual, or the state itself, dedicates property to a waqf, with revenues funding mosques, hospitals, schools, water systems, or care for the poor. The property cannot be sold, seized, or taxed. It exists in perpetuity for its stated purpose. The implications are profound. Waqf endowments fund institutions that might otherwise depend on the treasury or private charity. They create a semi-autonomous sector that provides services the government needs but does not directly control. They allow wealthy Muslims to gain religious merit while addressing social needs, and they protect property from confiscation. A noble can preserve family wealth by converting it into a waqf that employs his descendants as administrators. By the Abbasid period, waqf properties constitute perhaps a third of all productive land in some regions. They fund the hospitals where physicians practice medicine based on Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge. They support the madrasas where students study law, theology, mathematics, and astronomy. They maintain the water systems that keep cities functioning in arid climates. The Islamic world's remarkable infrastructure of learning and public service rests substantially on this elegant legal mechanism. Now consider the legal complexity. The empire includes Muslims subject to Sharia law, Christians and Jews subject to their own religious law in personal matters, and various local customs that predate Islamic rule. Rather than trying to impose uniformity, the Muslims create a system of legal pluralism unprecedented in its sophistication. Christians and Jews are recognized as dhimmi-protected peoples. They maintain their own courts for marriage, inheritance, and religious matters. A Christian merchant suing another Christian does so in a Christian court applying Christian law. But a contract between a Christian and a Muslim goes to a qadi, an Islamic judge who applies Islamic commercial law designed to handle such cases. Criminal matters and intercommunal disputes fall under Islamic jurisdiction. This system acknowledges reality. Trying to force all subjects under a single legal code would require massive enforcement, breed resentment, and likely fail. Legal pluralism turns potential conflict into administered diversity. Each community has autonomy in matters it cares about most deeply, while the overarching Islamic legal framework handles the commerce and criminal law that bind the empire together. The qadis themselves become crucial figures. They are judges, yes, but also legal scholars, interpreters of Sharia, and often administrators of waqf endowments. The most respected qadis attract students who study law for years, learning not just rules but the reasoning behind them, the precedents from previous cases, the scholarly debates about interpretation. This creates a class of legal experts whose authority derives from knowledge rather than political appointment alone. Yet here we find tension. Religious authority and political power are intertwined in Islam in ways that create both strength and vulnerability. The caliph is supposed to be both political leader and defender of the faith. The ulama, religious scholars, interpret sacred law but depend on caliphal patronage. When caliph and scholars agree, the system functions smoothly. When they disagree, who has final authority? The Abbasid caliphs attempt to resolve this through the Mihna, an inquisition in the 800s, where they try to enforce a particular theological position regarding the nature of the Quran. It fails catastrophically. Religious scholars resist, many are imprisoned, and the caliphs ultimately abandon the attempt. The lesson is clear. Political power cannot simply dictate religious interpretation. The ulama have independent authority that even caliphs must respect. This creates a balance. The caliph needs religious legitimacy that only scholars can provide. The scholars need political protection and financial support that only the caliph can guarantee. Neither can eliminate the other without destroying their own position. It is a dynamic tension that will characterize Islamic governance for centuries. The decision to move the capital from Damascus to Baghdad in 762 reveals strategic thinking about governance. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur chooses a site on the Tigris River, at the crossroads of trade routes from Persia, India, and Arabia. Baghdad is not just a capital, but a statement. This empire faces east as well as west, values Persian administrative traditions, and recognizes that the center of gravity has shifted from the Arab homeland to the Persian territories. The city is planned with extraordinary precision, a perfect circle, walls with 4 gates aligned with the compass points, the caliph's palace at the exact center. This is not just architecture but cosmology. Made physical, Baghdad represents the ordered universe with the caliph as its axis. Within a generation, it becomes the world's largest city, perhaps approaching 1 million inhabitants. It draws scholars from across the known world, merchants from China and Scandinavia, and creates a cosmopolitan culture that makes the provincial courts of Europe look backward by comparison. Governing from Baghdad means managing incredible ethnic and religious diversity. The bureaucracy itself reflects this. Persian-speaking administrators run many departments, bringing centuries of Persian governmental experience. Arabic remains the language of religion and law, but educated officials are expected to know multiple languages. Greek learning is translated into Arabic, then built upon by Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars working side by side. The Abbasids develop a system of provincial governance that balances local autonomy with central control. Each province has a governor appointed by the caliph, responsible for tax collection, maintaining order, and commanding local military forces. But governors are rotated regularly to prevent them from building independent power bases. They are watched by multiple officials: the postal inspectors, the tax collectors, the qadis, who report separately to Baghdad. This creates redundancy that prevents any single official from becoming too powerful. A corrupt governor might bribe the local tax collector, but can he also bribe the postal inspector, the qadi, the military commanders, and the merchants whose complaints reach Baghdad through trade networks? The overlapping jurisdictions seem inefficient, but they are deliberately designed to prevent exactly the kind of provincial independence that tore apart previous empires. Yet the system contains inherent contradictions. The more territory the empire controls, the harder central governance becomes. Distant provinces begin to drift toward autonomy. Spain, under the Umayyads of Cordoba, North Africa under various dynasties, Persia under local rulers. They may acknowledge the caliph's religious authority while ignoring his political directives. The empire becomes a patchwork of greater and lesser autonomy, held together by shared religion, trade networks, and cultural affinity more than direct political control. The Abbasids adapt by essentially franchising authority. A local ruler pays tribute, acknowledges the caliph's supremacy, mints coins in the caliph's name, and in return governs his territory with minimal interference. This is pragmatic federalism born of necessity. Better to receive tribute from a quasi-independent province than to spend blood and treasure trying to enforce direct control. The economic management of this diverse empire deserves particular attention. The caliphs must balance the needs of desert pastoralists, settled farmers, urban merchants, and everyone between. They invest heavily in infrastructure, the irrigation systems of Iraq, the waterworks of Persian cities, the roads and caravanserais that facilitate trade. These investments pay for themselves many times over through increased agricultural productivity and commercial taxation. Agricultural taxation is sophisticated to the point of being beautiful. In Iraq, officials maintain detailed records of every irrigation canal, including when it was built, who maintains it, and which fields it waters. Tax rates on irrigated land are higher than on rain-fed land, but not so high that farmers abandon irrigation. The system incentivizes agricultural improvement because increased productivity means increased tax revenue. The state and farmers prosper together. Trade taxation is equally clever. Customs posts at major cities collect tariffs on goods moving through, but the rates are low enough that merchants prefer the secure, well-maintained routes through Islamic territory over alternatives. A merchant pays perhaps 2.5% on goods' value, far less than the risk of robbery on unsecured routes or the predatory taxation of some rival powers. The volume of trade makes even low rates enormously profitable. The markets themselves are regulated with attention to detail that modern regulators might envy. The Mutasib market inspector enforces standard weights and measures, monitors food quality, prevents fraud, and ensures prices are fair. This is not just consumer protection, but economic statecraft. Merchants trust Islamic markets because they know the rules are enforced. That trust draws more merchants, more trade, more tax revenue, and more prosperity. Consider what this administrative sophistication makes possible. The empire can support a scholarly class that preserves Greek philosophy, advances mathematics, and makes astronomical observations of unprecedented precision. It can fund hospitals that treat rich and poor alike, teaching hospitals where medical knowledge accumulates and spreads. It can maintain libraries that collect manuscripts from across the known world. It can build architectural marvels, mosques, palaces, madrasas that still astonish us today. None of this happens without the unglamorous work of tax collectors and record keepers, postal riders and market inspectors, qadis and governors. The Islamic Golden Age rests on bureaucratic excellence as much as religious inspiration. Yet by the year 1000, this system is showing strain. Provincial autonomy is becoming outright independence. Turkish slave soldiers, Mamluks, are accumulating power that threatens caliphal authority. The Fatimids in Egypt claim their own caliphate, rejecting Abbasid legitimacy. The Seljuk Turks are moving into the Islamic heartland, bringing new military power, but also new instability. The administrative systems that govern the ungovernable are creaking under pressure. The empire's remarkable achievement creating order across unprecedented diversity is giving way to fragmentation, but the systems themselves will outlast the empire's political unity. The legal traditions, the bureaucratic methods, the commercial networks, the scholarly institutions, these will survive and flourish even as political authority fractures. The Muslims have proven that vast, diverse territories can be governed effectively. They have created administrative innovations that future empires will study and copy. They have shown that tolerance and efficiency can be mutually reinforcing, that diversity managed well is strength rather than weakness. But governance is never finished, never perfected. New challenges always arise, and the Islamic world is about to face challenges that will test everything these brilliant administrators have built. Follow the money. This simple directive reveals more about Islamic power than 1,000 battle narratives. While historians often focus on conquests and dynasties, The true foundation of Islamic civilization's dominance for nearly a millennium lies in commerce, in the systematic control of trade routes, the development of financial instruments that prefigure modern banking, and the transformation of information into commercial advantage. Consider the geography. By the year 800, Muslim merchants control both ends of the Silk Road, the sea routes from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, the trans-Saharan caravan routes, and the trade networks of the Mediterranean itself. This is not accidental. It is the result of deliberate strategy, military conquest aligned with commercial interest, and the recognition that whoever controls trade routes controls wealth itself. Stand at the port of Basra in Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates meet before flowing into the Persian Gulf. Ships arrive from India carrying pepper, cinnamon, and precious stones. Others come from East Africa with ivory, gold, and enslaved people. Chinese vessels bring silk, porcelain, and tea. This is not merely a port, but the beating heart of a commercial empire that spans 3 continents and touches 2 more. The goods flowing through Basra tell stories of integrated markets operating at scales Europe will not match for centuries. A merchant in Cordoba can order Chinese silk, knowing it will arrive in months via established routes at predictable costs, protected by recognized authorities. This predictability, this commercial infrastructure, is what transforms occasional trade into systematic wealth generation. The Muslim commercial revolution begins with a simple but powerful principle. Trade is honorable. Muhammad himself was a merchant. The Quran speaks respectfully of commerce and condemns only dishonest practices, not profit itself. This stands in stark contrast to Christian Europe, where merchants operate under constant suspicion and lending at interest is sinful. In the Islamic world, successful merchants are respected members of society, often patrons of learning and public works. This cultural acceptance of commerce creates a class of professional traders who develop increasingly sophisticated business methods. The suftaja, essentially a check or promissory note, allows a merchant in Baghdad to write a note payable in Cairo, avoiding the danger of transporting gold across bandit-infested routes. The merchant in Cairo presents the note and receives payment from the writer's agent there. The system requires trust, verification, and a network of reliable partners, all of which Muslim merchants develop with remarkable efficiency. Consider the implications. A merchant network spanning from Spain to China, able to move funds through paper instruments, can operate at scales impossible for those restricted to physical currency. They can pool capital for large ventures. They can speculate on price differences between distant markets. They can offer credit to producers and collect payment at delivery. These are the foundations of sophisticated capitalism, emerging in the Islamic world while Europe still operates on largely subsistence agriculture and local barter. The hawala system develops even greater subtlety. A merchant gives money to a hawalada in one city, who contacts his counterpart in another city to pay the equivalent amount to the designated recipient. No physical money crosses the distance. The 2 hawaladars settle accounts later through their ongoing business relationships. This is transfer of value without transfer of currency, an abstraction that requires deep trust networks and sophisticated record-keeping. Muslim merchants create partnerships that distribute both risk and reward. The Mudaraba partnership sees one party provide capital, while another provides labor and expertise, with profits split according to pre-agreed ratios. This allows wealthy individuals to invest in trade without traveling themselves, while giving skilled traders access to capital they could not otherwise command. It is venture capital, medieval style, and it finances trading expeditions from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Now examine the trade routes themselves not just as paths, but as strategic assets to be controlled and defended. The Silk Road through Central Asia requires protection from bandits, maintenance of caravanserais where merchants can rest and resupply, and political relationships with the various peoples along the route. Muslim rulers invest heavily in this infrastructure because the customs, revenues, and economic activity justify the expense many times over. The sea routes demand different but equally sophisticated management. Muslim sailors master the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean, sailing east when the winds favor it and returning west when they shift. They develop the dhow, a ship design optimized for these conditions, capable of carrying substantial cargo while navigating coastal waters. They create detailed knowledge of ports, currents, and hazards, knowledge that is carefully guarded as a commercial secret. The trans-Saharan routes reveal how Muslim traders turn hostile geography into commercial monopoly. Crossing the Sahara requires detailed knowledge of oases, ability to manage camels, and relationships with the desert peoples who control various segments. Muslim traders from North Africa develop all three, creating trade networks that bring West African gold north in exchange for salt, cloth, and manufactured goods. The gold flowing from Mali and Ghana through these routes helps finance the entire Islamic world. Control of these routes means control of information, and here Muslim traders excel. They know which goods are scarce where, which markets pay premium prices, what political disruptions might affect supply. A trader in Cairo knows about Persian silk shortages before Persian merchants do, because the postal system and merchant networks move information faster than anyone else's. This information asymmetry is ruthlessly exploited for profit. The markets themselves become increasingly sophisticated. The Suku marketplace in major cities is not chaotic, but highly organized. Similar trades cluster together: the spice market, the cloth market, the gold market. This clustering allows specialization and easy price comparison. A buyer seeking the best price on saffron walks through a street where dozens of spice merchants compete directly. Competition drives efficiency and keeps prices reasonable. But the markets are also sites of collusion when it serves merchant interests. The merchant guilds that develop in various cities can coordinate to manipulate prices, restrict entry to profitable trades, and lobby political authorities for favorable regulations. This is not free market capitalism, but organized commercial power, often working in alliance with political authorities who take their cut of the profits. The sophistication of Islamic finance extends to currency exchange. Money changers, sarafs, develop complex knowledge of exchange rates between the various currencies circulating through the Islamic world and beyond. They profit from the spread between buying and selling rates, but they also provide crucial services. A merchant arriving with Byzantine gold coins needs local currency to buy goods. The saraf provides this service while assessing coin purity, detecting counterfeits, and maintaining the liquidity that makes commerce function smoothly. Consider the economic warfare possibilities this commercial dominance enables. When the Abbasid caliphs wish to pressure the Byzantine Empire, they can restrict trade, cutting off goods that Constantinople depends on. The Byzantines can respond in kind, but they suffer more because Muslim merchants have alternative routes and markets, while Byzantine traders depend heavily on access to Islamic territories. Economic coercion becomes a weapon as potent as armies. The slave trade, though morally abhorrent to modern sensibilities, is economically crucial to understanding Islamic commercial power. Enslaved people flow from Eastern Europe through the Black Sea, from Africa through both Saharan and sea routes, from Central Asia and India. They are soldiers, servants, laborers, and sometimes administrators or scholars. The trade in human beings generates enormous profits and provides labor for everything from agriculture to military service. The economic logic is brutal but clear. Enslaved soldiers, Mamluks, owe loyalty only to whoever purchases and trains them, making them more reliable than tribal warriors with their own allegiances. Enslaved agricultural workers can be deployed to open new farmland or maintain irrigation systems. The commercial calculus treats humans as commodities to be bought, sold, and exploited. This moral stain on Islamic civilization exists alongside its cultural and scientific achievements, a reminder that economic sophistication and ethical behavior are not synonymous. The agricultural economy underlying all this commerce deserves attention. The Islamic world experiences an agricultural revolution between the 8th and 10th centuries that rivals the later European agricultural revolution in importance. New crops spread along trade routes: hard wheat, rice, citrus fruits, cotton, sugarcane. Each requires specific cultivation techniques, irrigation methods, and processing knowledge. Muslim agricultural treatises systematize this knowledge. They describe optimal planting times, irrigation techniques, soil preparation, pest control, and crop rotation. This is not folklore passed down orally, but written, studied, and deliberately disseminated across the Islamic world. A Persian farming technique can be adapted for use in Spain because both regions have access to the same agricultural literature. The economic impact is profound. New crops mean more diverse diets, higher population, and expanded trade opportunities. Cotton cultivation supports textile industries. Sugarcane creates a new luxury product that gradually becomes a staple. Citrus fruits become a significant trade commodity. Each innovation in agriculture ripples through the entire economy, creating new wealth and supporting larger populations. The urban economy grows in tandem with agricultural productivity. Cities expand because surplus food production allows more people to specialize in crafts, trade, and services rather than farming. Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, Damascus. These cities reach sizes that European cities will not match for centuries. They are manufacturing centers where skilled craftsmen produce goods for local use and export. The textile industry exemplifies this urban manufacturing. Muslim weavers produce everything from rough cloth for common use to elaborate silk brocades for the wealthy. The quality is often superior to European products, the designs more sophisticated, the colors more vibrant due to better dyes and techniques. These textiles are major export items, generating profits that flow back into the urban economy. Metalworking, ceramics, glassmaking, leatherworking, each craft develops guild structures, apprenticeship systems, and quality standards. This is organized production, with masters training apprentices in techniques refined over generations. The products compete successfully across the known world because of consistent quality and competitive pricing. The economic integration of this vast system creates dependencies and opportunities. A disruption in one region affects markets thousands of miles away. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century devastate Central Asian trade routes, shifting commerce towards sea routes and benefiting Egyptian and Syrian merchants while harming Persian and Iraqi traders. Economic actors constantly adapt to changing conditions, seeking advantage in every shift. The Waqf system, discussed earlier for its administrative role, has profound economic implications. Vast amounts of productive property are tied up in perpetual religious endowments, removed from the market economy. This creates stability. Waqf properties do not change hands with political upheavals but also rigidity. Capital that might be invested in new ventures or used to respond to economic changes instead flows into maintaining existing institutions. Some scholars argue this contributes to eventual Islamic economic stagnation, as too much wealth becomes locked in Waqf endowments that cannot be redirected to new opportunities. Others point out that Waqfs provide crucial stability and fund institutions that support economic activity. The debate continues, but the sheer scale of the Waqf system, perhaps a third of all productive land in some regions, makes it economically significant, regardless of one's assessment of its overall impact. By the year 1000, the Islamic world dominates global trade in ways that will not be seriously challenged for centuries. Muslim merchants are present in markets from West Africa to Southeast Asia, from the Russian steppes to the East African coast. They do not merely participate in trade, they often control it, setting prices, determining what goods flow where, and extracting profits at every stage. This commercial supremacy generates the wealth that funds everything else. The palaces and mosques, the libraries and hospitals, the armies and bureaucracies all rest ultimately on the commercial success that brings tax revenue and customs duties into caliphal treasuries. The Islamic Golden Age is not just about religious inspiration or military conquest. It is substantially financed by trade profits and the sophisticated commercial systems that generate them. Yet economic dominance, like military power, is never permanent. European merchants are learning the techniques of Islamic commerce, adapting them to their own purposes. The Crusades, for all their religious motivation, expose Europeans to Islamic economic sophistication and create trade relationships that begin to erode Muslim monopolies. The Mongols will create new trade routes that bypass traditional Islamic control. The commercial empire Muslim traders have built is magnificent, sophisticated, and enormously profitable. But it exists in a dynamic world where competitors seek advantage, routes shift, and technological changes create new possibilities. The monopoly game continues, but the rules are about to change in ways that will shift economic power away from the Islamic world toward the rising powers of Europe and East Asia. For now, however, Muslim merchants stand at the center of global commerce, their networks spanning continents, their financial instruments enabling trade at unprecedented scales, their information advantages yielding consistent profits. They have turned commerce into statecraft, trade routes into strategic assets, and economic intelligence into power. The money tells the story, and the story is one of extraordinary success. The year is 1099. Jerusalem, one of Islam's holiest cities, falls to Crusader armies who slaughter most of its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. The streets run with blood, mosques are defiled. The shock reverberates across the Islamic world. For centuries, Muslim armies have been the conquerors. Now, suddenly, they are the conquered. How do civilizations respond when the unthinkable becomes reality? The Islamic world's answer to this question, and to the even more devastating Mongol invasions that will follow, reveals remarkable capacity for adaptation, strategic thinking, and survival. This is not a story of decline, but of resilience, of learning from enemies, of transforming threats into opportunities, and of refusing to accept defeat as final. The Crusades initially catch the Islamic world fragmented and unprepared. The great Abbasid Caliphate has splintered into competing dynasties. The Seljuk Turks control much of the Middle East, but are themselves divided by succession disputes. The Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt rivals the Abbasids for religious authority. When the Crusaders arrive, Muslim rulers often see them as just another factor in regional power struggles rather than an existential threat. This changes as the Crusaders establish kingdoms in the Levant and demonstrate they intend to stay. Muslim leaders must develop responses, and here we see strategic diversity that is itself a form of strength. Different leaders try different approaches, learning from each other's successes and failures. Saladin Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi provides the template for successful resistance. He is a Kurdish general who rises through military service to found the Ayyubid dynasty, uniting Egypt and Syria under his rule. But his genius lies not in military skill alone, though he possesses that in abundance. He understands that defeating the Crusaders requires political unification of Muslim territories, diplomatic isolation of the Crusader states, and presentation of the conflict as religious jihad that can mobilize popular support. Watch how methodically Saladin builds his power. He takes control of Egypt, ends the Fatimid Caliphate, and acknowledges the Abbasid Caliph's authority, unifying Sunni Islam's religious legitimacy behind his cause. He conquers Yemen to secure his southern flank and control trade routes. He takes Damascus and Aleppo, encircling the Crusader states. Only after years of preparation does he move against the Crusaders themselves. The Battle of Hattin in 1187 demonstrates tactical brilliance. Saladin lures the Crusader army into waterless terrain during summer heat, positions his forces to cut them off from wells, and waits for thirst and exhaustion to do half his work. When he attacks, the Crusaders are already defeated by the desert. The Christian army is destroyed. Jerusalem falls shortly after, recaptured through negotiation and siege. But notice how Saladin treats his defeated enemies. Unlike the massacre that accompanied the Crusader conquest, he allows Christian inhabitants to ransom themselves or leave safely. Churches are preserved. This is calculated mercy. It demonstrates Islamic superiority, encourages future surrenders, and denies the Crusaders' atrocity stories to rally European support. Saladin becomes legendary not just for victory but for chivalry, respected even by his enemies. The Ayyubid approach combines military pressure with diplomatic sophistication. They negotiate truces when advantageous, trade prisoners, even form temporary alliances with Crusader states against rival Muslim rulers when necessary. This is realpolitik at its finest. Ideology serves strategy rather than constraining it. The goal is not purity of method, but effectiveness of outcome. Yet the Crusader threat, severe as it seems, pales beside what is coming from the east. In 1219, Mongol armies under Genghis Khan destroy the Muslim city of Bukhara. What follows is catastrophic beyond European comprehension. The Mongols sweep through Central Asia, Persia, and into the heart of the Islamic world with unprecedented savagery. Baghdad, the city of peace, capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, greatest city of the Islamic world, falls in 1258. The Mongols slaughter perhaps hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. Libraries accumulated over centuries are destroyed, their books dumped into the Tigris until the river runs black with ink. The last Abbasid Caliph is executed. 500 years of caliphal rule ends in blood and ashes. This is catastrophe on a civilizational scale. How do you respond when your greatest city is destroyed, your religious leader killed, your armies shattered by enemies whose military system seems invincible? The Islamic world survives through adaptation so thorough it transforms both the Muslims and their conquerors. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Islamic resilience, the ability to absorb enemies and turn them into defenders of the faith. The Mamluks in Egypt demonstrate one survival strategy. They are originally enslaved soldiers, purchased as boys from Turkish and Circassian peoples, trained in military arts, and formed into elite units. By the 13th century, they have seized power in Egypt, creating a military oligarchy where political authority passes not through heredity, but through the barracks and battlefield. This system seems unstable, and in many ways it is, but it produces phenomenal military effectiveness. Mamluk soldiers owe loyalty only to their military household, not to tribe or family. They are professional warriors, trained from youth in cavalry tactics, archery, and swordsmanship. They are motivated by the prospect of rising through military achievement to positions of wealth and power. When the Mongols push into Syria in 1260, the Mamluks meet them at Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath. For the first time, a Muslim army defeats the Mongols decisively. The victory is not accidental, but the result of careful preparation, superior intelligence about Mongol tactics, and military innovations that counter Mongol mobility with disciplined formations and superior archery. The Mamluks study their enemies obsessively. They learn that Mongol armies, for all their fearsome reputation, have weaknesses. They are vulnerable when lured into terrain that limits their cavalry's mobility. They depend on complex supply lines that can be disrupted. Their commanders sometimes quarrel among themselves, creating opportunities for diplomatic wedges. Most importantly, the Mamluks understand that the Mongols can be culturally absorbed. Many Mongol tribes are shamanist or Buddhist, but some are already Muslim or Christian. The Mamluks begin a systematic campaign of conversion and alliance, offering Mongol commanders positions of honor in Muslim service, arranging marriages between Mongol nobility and Muslim elite, and presenting Islam as the religion of civilization versus Mongol barbarity. The strategy works brilliantly. By the early 1400s, the Mongol Ilkhanate that rules Persia has converted to Islam. Mongol Khans become Muslim sultans. Their descendants will speak Persian, patronize Islamic art and architecture, and defend Muslim territories against new threats. The conquerors have become the conquered, not through military defeat but through cultural assimilation. This pattern repeats across the Islamic world. The Seljuk Turks arrived as conquerors but became defenders of Islam. The Mamluks were enslaved as children but built empires as adults. The Mongols destroyed Muslim cities, but their descendants erected mosques. Islam demonstrates an extraordinary capacity to absorb invaders, convert them to the faith, and harness their military power for Islamic purposes. The mechanism behind this absorption deserves attention. Islam offers clear paths to legitimacy for military strongmen. Convert, rule justly according to Islamic law, patronize religious scholars and institutions, and you can transform from foreign invader to legitimate Muslim ruler within a generation. The ulama religious scholars provide this legitimacy in exchange for protection and patronage. It is a symbiotic relationship that benefits both parties while providing stability. Consider the technological adaptation that accompanies cultural absorption. Muslim rulers observe that Mongol success stems partly from superior horse archery and mobility. They adopt these techniques, creating their own composite cavalry forces. They study Mongol intelligence, gathering the use of scouts, the systematic collection of information about enemies, and the strategic deception. These methods are incorporated into Muslim military practice. The Ottomans, rising in Anatolia during the 13th and 14th centuries, provide perhaps the ultimate example of Islamic adaptation and innovation. They are originally a small Turkish principality on the Byzantine frontier, one among many. What makes them special is their willingness to innovate and their genius for synthesizing the best practices of multiple cultures. The Ottomans create the Devshirme system, collecting Christian boys from the Balkans, converting them to Islam, and training them as either Janissary soldiers or administrative officials. This gives them a loyal military and bureaucratic corps that owes everything to the Sultan and is not entangled in Turkish tribal politics. It is the Mamluk principle applied systematically at imperial scale, but the Ottomans' greatest innovation is their adoption and development of gunpowder technology. Europeans develop cannon and handguns in the 14th century. The Ottomans recognize immediately that this changes warfare, fundamentally. They begin manufacturing their own gunpowder weapons, hiring European artillery experts, and developing tactics that integrate firearms with traditional cavalry. By the mid-1500s, Ottoman armies carry some of the world's most advanced artillery. Their cannon can reduce fortress walls that had stood for centuries. Their janissaries are armed with muskets that give infantry parity with cavalry for the first time in Islamic military history. The conquest of Constantinople in 1453 succeeds partly through massive cannon that pound the ancient walls into rubble. This is adaptation at breathtaking speed. From first contact with gunpowder weapons to mastery of the technology in barely a century, the Ottomans do not merely copy European innovations, they improve upon them, creating larger cannon, developing better tactics for siege warfare, and training specialized corps to operate the new weapons. The cultural implications are profound. Gunpowder warfare reduces the advantage of traditional cavalry, the military elite of Islamic society. It empowers centralized states with resources to manufacture cannon and maintain professional armies. It changes fortress design, siege tactics, and the entire strategic calculus of warfare. The Ottomans embrace these changes while many European powers resist, giving them temporary but decisive military advantage. Yet adaptation is not merely military. Islamic scholars respond to the challenge of new knowledge and new threats by synthesizing Islamic tradition with useful innovations. When Mongol astronomical observations prove more accurate than earlier Muslim tables, Islamic astronomers incorporate the new data while maintaining the mathematical frameworks developed by earlier scholars like Al-Tusi. Medical knowledge from India, China, and Europe is evaluated, tested, and adopted when effective. The hospital traditions of the Islamic world, already advanced, incorporate new treatments and procedures regardless of their origin. This is pragmatic eclecticism, taking what works while maintaining Islamic identity. The legal scholars ulama adapt Sharia to new conditions while maintaining its fundamental principles. When Muslims find themselves as minorities under non-Muslim rule after Mongol or European conquests, fatwas are issued explaining how to maintain faith under these conditions. When new commercial practices emerge that do not fit traditional categories, legal interpretations evolve to accommodate them. Islamic law proves flexible enough to address novel situations while remaining rooted in Quran and Hadith. Consider the Ottoman millet system, which takes the earlier Islamic tradition of legal pluralism and systematizes it at imperial scale. Each religious community, Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Christian, Jewish, is recognized as a millet with autonomy over personal law, education, and internal governance. The communities pay taxes and acknowledge Ottoman political authority, but maintain their cultural and religious identity. This is not tolerance in the modern liberal sense. It is structured hierarchy with Muslims on top and religious minorities in subordinate but protected positions. Yet it allows the Ottoman Empire to govern incredible diversity without the constant rebellion that religious persecution would provoke. Different faiths coexist not through secularism, but through organized pluralism under Islamic political supremacy. The adaptation extends to economic policy. The Ottomans recognized that European merchants offer access to new markets and products. They grant capitulations, commercial privileges to European traders, allowing them to operate under their own laws in Ottoman territories. This seems like weakness but is actually calculated policy. The Ottomans tax this commerce, benefit from access to European markets, and use the commercial relationships to gather intelligence about European politics and technology. Throughout all these adaptations, a core principle operates. Islam is not static tradition, but living practice. The religion provides identity, law, and worldview, but Muslims can and must adapt to changing circumstances while remaining faithful. This flexibility, this refusal to see innovation as betrayal of tradition, is what allows Islamic civilization to survive threats that destroy other societies. By the early 1600s, the Islamic world has weathered the Crusades, absorbed the Mongol invasions, and adapted to gunpowder warfare. Three great Islamic empires dominate much of the known world: the Ottomans in the Middle East and southeastern Europe, the Safavids in Persia, and the Mughals in India. They are not merely survivors, but thriving powers with sophisticated administration, vibrant culture, and formidable military strength. The adaptation that made this possible, the willingness to learn from enemies, adopt useful innovations, convert conquerors, and maintain Islamic identity while embracing change, is one of history's great examples of civilizational resilience. Islam has proven that core identity can coexist with radical adaptation, that military defeat need not be permanent, and that cultural confidence enables rather than prevents learning from others. But new challenges are emerging. European powers are developing new technologies, new forms of political organization, and new economic systems that will shift global power balances. The Islamic world's next great test will not be military invasion, but the more insidious challenge of imperial competition, where the rules of the game itself are changing in ways that favor European advantages. The story of adaptation and survival continues, but the nature of the threats and the responses required are about to evolve in ways that will test Islamic civilization as never before. The 18th century presents Islamic powers with a puzzle more complex than any military threat: European. Empires are not invading with armies, not yet, They are arriving with trade deals, offering military advisors, proposing technological transfers, and slowly, methodically, weaving webs of economic and political dependence. This is imperialism of a new kind, and the traditional Islamic responses prove inadequate. Consider the Ottoman Empire in 1700. It still controls vast territories from Hungary to Yemen, from Algeria to Iraq. Its armies remain formidable, its administration functions, yet something fundamental has shifted. The balance of power is tilting away from Istanbul toward European capitals, and Ottoman officials sense it, even if they cannot fully articulate why. The problem is not military weakness alone, though Ottoman defeats at Vienna in 1683 and subsequent territorial losses alarm the court. The deeper issue is systemic. European powers are developing new forms of economic organization, new technologies, new military systems, and new political structures that give them advantages in ways the Ottomans struggle to counter. The Ottoman response reveals both strategic sophistication and tragic limitations. Sultan Selim III, ruling from 1789 to 1807, attempts comprehensive reform. He studies European military methods, hires French advisors to train new model armies, tries to reform the tax system to generate more revenue, and seeks to centralize power that has drifted to provincial governors and local notables. These are sensible reforms. The problem is implementation. The Janissaries, once the empire's elite infantry, have become a conservative military caste resistant to change. They see European-style reforms as threats to their privileges and position. When Selim creates new military units trained in European tactics, the Janissaries rebel. Selim is deposed and eventually murdered. His reforms are largely reversed. This pattern repeats tragically. Reformist sultans attempt modernization. Vested interests resist. The reformer is overthrown or forced to back down. The empire lurches between reform and reaction, never quite achieving the systematic transformation needed to compete with European powers. Yet, the Ottomans are not passive victims. They play the great game with considerable skill, using European rivalries to maintain independence. When Russia pressures from the north, the Ottomans court British and French support. When Britain becomes too influential, they turn to Germany. This is the classic strategy of playing stronger powers against each other, and the Ottomans execute it with diplomatic sophistication that keeps the empire alive decades longer than it might otherwise have survived. The Tanzimat reforms of the mid-1800s represent the most comprehensive Ottoman attempt at modernization. They promise equality before law regardless of religion, rationalization of administration, modern schools, updated legal codes, and infrastructure development. These are not merely imitations of Europe, but adaptations of European methods to Ottoman circumstances. Some reforms succeed remarkably. The Ottoman postal system modernizes. Telegraph lines spread across the empire. New schools produce officials with modern education. Legal reforms create more predictable commercial law that encourages trade. But the fundamental contradiction remains how to modernize while preserving the Islamic character of the empire. How to grant equality to Christian subjects without undermining the Islamic political supremacy that defines Ottoman identity. The ulama religious scholars resist reforms that seem to privilege European-style secularism over Islamic law. Conservative Muslims see the reforms as capitulation to Christian powers. Nationalists among subject peoples, Greeks, Armenians, Arabs, use the promise of equality to demand autonomy or independence. The reformers satisfy no one completely and antagonize almost everyone, partially. Turn your attention east to Persia, where the Qajar dynasty faces similar challenges with different constraints. Persia lies between the expanding Russian Empire to the north and British India to the southeast. The country becomes a chessboard where Russian and British interests compete, with Persian rulers trying desperately to maintain independence through balancing one against the other. The Persian strategy emphasizes granting commercial concessions to European powers while playing them off against each other. British companies receive rights to develop telegraph lines. Russians get railroad concessions. The Persians collect fees and try to ensure no single European power dominates completely. This is survival through managed dependency, acknowledging that Persia cannot match European power, but can perhaps manipulate European rivalries. The tobacco concession crisis of 1891 reveals both the strategy's logic and its limits. The Shah grants a British company monopoly rights over tobacco production and sale, a major revenue source and daily necessity for most Persians. The religious establishment issues a fatwa declaring tobacco use forbidden under these conditions. The population complies with stunning discipline. The Shah is forced to cancel the concession, paying massive compensation to the British company. This demonstrates that traditional religious authority retains power to mobilize popular resistance against foreign encroachment. Yet it also shows the weakness of the Persian state. It cannot even control tobacco sales in its own territory without risking popular uprising. The episode reveals how imperialism operates through economic penetration before military conquest, and how local populations can resist through religious mobilization. The ulama in Persia develop a political role different from their Ottoman counterparts. They are not state employees but maintain independent funding through religious taxes and endowments. This gives them freedom to criticize the Shah's policies, particularly when those policies seem to benefit foreign powers at Persian expense. Religion becomes a vehicle for anti-imperialist nationalism, a pattern that will have profound consequences in the 20th century. Throughout the Islamic world, local rulers attempt variations on the same strategy, accepting European military advisors and technology, while trying to preserve political independence. Egypt, under Muhammad Ali in the early 1800s, pursues aggressive modernization, creating European-style armies, building factories, and attempting to establish Egypt as an independent power. Muhammad Ali's project is remarkably successful initially. His modernized armies conquer Sudan and threaten the Ottoman Empire itself. His factories produce textiles that compete with European imports. He seems to prove that Islamic states can adopt European methods while maintaining independence. But European powers, particularly Britain, cannot allow a strong Egypt that might threaten their interests. They force Muhammad Ali to dismantle his factories, reduce his army, and accept Ottoman suzerainty. The lesson is brutal. Modernization is not enough if European powers decide you have become too successful. The rules of the game are rigged against non-European powers achieving genuine parity. The tragedy of Islamic responses to imperialism is that the strategically sound approaches, playing European powers against each other, adopting useful technologies, reforming administration, are insufficient against opponents who fundamentally control the global economic and political system. When balancing strategies fail, when reforms prove inadequate, the Islamic powers face impossible choices. Some rulers attempt isolation, rejecting European influence entirely. This preserves cultural authenticity but leaves them militarily and economically weaker relative to European powers. Others embrace wholesale westernization, alienating conservative elements of their populations and often creating backlash. Most try to find middle paths that satisfy no one completely. The development of pan-Islamic ideology represents one response to this dilemma. If individual Islamic states cannot resist European imperialism, perhaps Islamic solidarity across borders can create countervailing power. Sultan Abdul Hamid, the second of the Ottoman Empire, promotes himself as caliph of all Muslims, attempting to use religious authority to build political influence beyond his shrinking territorial control. The strategy has some success. Muslims in British India, Russian Central Asia, and European colonies look to the Ottoman Caliph as a symbol of Islamic identity and resistance to European domination. Pan-Islamic movements develop that cut across national boundaries, but the practical power this generates is limited. Religious solidarity does not translate easily into military or economic coordination. The intellectual ferment this period produces deserves attention. Muslim reformers like Jamal al-Din al-Afghani argue that Islam and modernity are compatible, that Muslims must adopt European science and technology while rejecting European political domination. They seek to demonstrate that Islamic civilization's earlier achievements in science and philosophy prove Muslims can modernize without losing their identity. Others, like Muhammad Abduh in Egypt, attempt to reform Islamic law and education to address modern conditions. They argue that Sharia is flexible enough to accommodate change, that Islamic principles can guide modern societies, and that blind imitation of either the European present or the Islamic past is insufficient. What is needed is creative synthesis. Islamic values applied to contemporary challenges. These intellectual movements influence educated Muslims across the Islamic world. They create space for reform without complete westernization, but they also reveal deep disagreements about what Islam requires, what modernity means, and how to balance tradition with change. The debates continue today, shaped by questions first articulated during this period of imperial pressure. The scramble for Africa in the late 1800s shows Islamic powers becoming victims rather than players in imperial competition. North African territories that acknowledged Ottoman suzerainty, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, are conquered by France, Italy, and Britain. The conquest is justified through racist ideologies claiming European superiority and civilizing missions, but the reality is raw imperialism seeking territory, resources, and strategic advantage. Islamic resistance takes various forms. In Algeria, Abd al-Qadir leads guerrilla warfare against French conquest for years before his eventual defeat. In Sudan, the Mahdi creates an Islamic state that defeats British forces before eventually being crushed. These resistance movements demonstrate that Islamic populations will fight foreign domination, often with considerable success initially, but they cannot ultimately overcome European technological and organizational advantages. The pattern repeats across the Islamic world: initial resistance, some successes, eventual defeat or accommodation. Local rulers make deals with colonial powers, becoming client states that preserve nominal independence while accepting European dominance. Others fight and are conquered. Either way, by 1900, most of the Islamic world lives under European political control or economic domination. Yet even in defeat, strategic thinking continues. Muslim intellectuals study European success, seeking lessons that might enable future Islamic resurgence. They ask searching questions. Why did Europe surpass the Islamic world when Islamic civilization was once more advanced? What can be learned from European political systems, economic organization, and scientific methods? How can Muslims adopt useful elements of police? European civilization while maintaining Islamic identity? These questions have no easy answers, but the very act of asking them seriously represents a kind of resistance to the colonial narrative that presents Europeans as inherently superior and Muslims as inherently backward. It maintains the possibility of Islamic revival even during the nadir of Islamic political power. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 represents one attempt to answer these questions through action. Young Ottoman officers and intellectuals, educated in European ideas, seize power and attempt to transform the empire into a constitutional state with modern institutions. They believe that European political forms, parliament, constitution, rule of law, can revitalize the empire while preserving its Islamic character. The experiment fails catastrophically. The empire fragments into competing factions. Subject nationalities seek independence rather than accepting reformed Ottoman rule. European powers exploit the chaos to seize more territory. World War I destroys what remains of Ottoman power. By 1923, the Ottoman Empire is dead, replaced by a Turkish republic that explicitly rejects the Islamic political identity that defined 6 centuries of Ottoman rule. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the reduction of Persia to a weak state dominated by European interests represents the low point of Islamic political power. The civilization that once ruled from Spain to India, that preserved and advanced human knowledge while Europe languished, that created administrative systems of extraordinary sophistication. This civilization is now subordinated to European empires, whose own rise was partly enabled by knowledge transmitted through Islamic civilization. The irony is bitter. The mathematics that Europeans used to build more accurate canon came partly from Muslim scholars. The navigational techniques that enabled European global exploration were refined in the Islamic world. The very concept of organized scientific investigation, systematic observation, experimentation, mathematical analysis was developed to high art by Muslim scholars during Europe's medieval period. Yet by the early 20th century, all this seems ancient history. European powers stride the world as masters. Islamic civilization appears to have become a museum piece, studied by Orientalists who often view it with condescension, preserved in academic departments, but apparently irrelevant to contemporary power. This assessment will prove spectacularly wrong. The Islamic world is not finished, but entering a period of transformation that will reshape global politics. The strategies developed during the imperial competition period, playing great powers against each other, using religious identity to mobilize resistance, adapting foreign methods while preserving Islamic identity, will prove crucial in the coming age of decolonization and Islamic resurgence. But in 1920, as European powers carve up the Ottoman Empire's corpse and draw arbitrary borders across the Middle East, as they install client rulers and extract resources through colonial administration, few observers would have predicted the Islamic world's return to global prominence within a century. The great game seemed finished, with European powers the clear winners. The next phase of history would demonstrate that reports of Islam's irrelevance were greatly exaggerated. In 1938, geologists working for Standard Oil of California strike oil in Saudi Arabia. The well produces 1,600 barrels per day. It is the beginning of something extraordinary, the discovery of reserves that will reshape global power and return the Islamic world to geopolitical prominence after a century of subordination. Consider what oil means strategically. Modern industrial economies depend absolutely on petroleum for transportation, manufacturing, heating, and countless other applications. Control the oil, and you influence the economies of nations. The major oil reserves of the Middle East lie under territories that were, mere decades earlier, considered backwaters of European colonial empires. Geography has given Islamic nations a resource that cannot be ignored, cannot be easily seized, and generates wealth on scales that rival the commercial dominance Muslims enjoyed a millennium earlier. The Saudi monarchy recognizes immediately the strategic value of their geological fortune. They negotiate carefully with American oil companies, insisting on terms more favorable than colonial arrangements elsewhere. They understand that oil creates leverage. American companies need access to Saudi reserves, giving the kingdom influence over the world's most powerful nation. This is asymmetric power, where a relatively small nation can affect a superpower's interests. But the Saudis add another dimension to their strategy. They position themselves as guardians of Islam's holiest sites, Mecca and Medina, and use oil wealth to project religious influence globally. They fund mosque construction from Indonesia to Europe, distribute religious literature, promoting their particular interpretation of Islam, and provide scholarships bringing Muslim students from across the world to Saudi religious universities. This is soft power at massive scale. The Saudis cannot match American military might or European technological sophistication, but they can shape how millions of Muslims understand their faith. They can influence Islamic movements and parties worldwide, and they can use religious authority to build political alliances that serve Saudi interests. Oil wealth makes this possible. Strategic vision makes it effective. The creation of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries in 1960, demonstrates growing sophistication in wielding oil as geopolitical weapon. Member nations, many of them Muslim-majority countries, coordinate production and pricing. When they act in concert, they can affect global oil prices and thus the economic health of nations dependent on imported petroleum. The 1973 oil embargo provides dramatic proof. In response to Western support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, Arab oil producers cut production and embargo sales to nations supporting Israel. Oil prices quadruple. Western economies experience severe recessions. Gas stations in America run dry. The psychological impact is enormous suddenly. Arab nations that were dismissed as weak clients of Western power have demonstrated they can inflict real economic pain on the world's most powerful countries. This is a lesson in strategic leverage. Military weakness does not preclude effective power if you control something others desperately need. The embargo does not last. Economic interdependence works both ways, and oil producers need revenue from sales. But it establishes that Islamic nations, or at least oil-producing Islamic nations, have returned to the table of global power politics as players rather than pawns. Yet oil is not the only source of Islamic resurgence. Demographics play an equally important role. Muslim populations are growing faster than most non-Muslim populations, both through higher birth rates and through conversion. By the early 21st century, Muslims constitute perhaps a quarter of the world's population, with projections suggesting nearly a third by mid-century. This demographic weight translates into political influence in multiple ways. In democracies, Muslim voters become constituencies that political parties must court. In authoritarian states, Muslim populations represent potential sources of either support or resistance that rulers must manage. Globally, Muslim-majority nations constitute a significant voting bloc in international organizations. The success of Islamic political parties in democratic elections demonstrates this demographic power. In Turkey, Indonesia, Malaysia, and elsewhere, parties emphasizing Islamic identity win elections and form governments. They prove that Islamic political movements can operate effectively within democratic frameworks, adapting religious principles to electoral politics. Turkey, under the AKP, the Justice and Development Party, provides a case study. The party combines Islamic identity with economic competence, winning elections repeatedly by delivering economic growth while carefully respecting democratic norms just enough to avoid military intervention. Turkey becomes more assertively Islamic in foreign policy, while maintaining NATO membership and seeking European Union accession. This is strategic balancing, maintaining Western ties while building influence in the Islamic world. The development of Islamic finance represents another dimension of modern Islamic influence. Islamic banks and financial institutions, operating according to Sharia principles that forbid interest but allow profit sharing, manage trillions of dollars in assets. They offer alternative financial products, sukuk bonds, murabaha contracts, takaful insurance that appeal to Muslims seeking religiously compliant investment while functioning within global capital markets. This is not merely religious observance but strategic positioning. Islamic finance creates financial infrastructure independent of Western banking systems. It builds economic ties among Muslim-majority nations. It offers an alternative model that some present as more ethical than conventional finance, especially after the 2008 financial crisis that originated in Western financial institutions. The political implications extend beyond economics. Nations with sophisticated Islamic financial sectors, Malaysia, the Gulf states, Pakistan, can offer development finance to poorer Muslim nations, building influence through economic assistance. This is the Waqf principle applied at international scale, using wealth to serve religious community while building political power. Consider the strategic use of pan-Islamic solidarity in international relations. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, with 57 member states, coordinates positions on issues affecting Muslims globally. While often divided on specific questions, the organization provides a framework for collective action that amplifies individual nations' influence. When Muslims face persecution, Rohingya in Myanmar, Uyghurs in China, Palestinians under occupation, Islamic nations can coordinate diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and international advocacy. The effectiveness varies, constrained by member nations' competing interests and varying power, but the potential for coordinated action forces major powers to consider Islamic opinion in ways unnecessary during the colonial period. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 demonstrates religious ideology's power to reshape geopolitics. Shia clerics overthrow the Shah, a Western-backed modernizer, with powerful military and security forces through mass mobilization grounded in Islamic identity. The revolution creates an Islamic republic explicitly rejecting Western political models and economic domination. Iran's revolution sends shockwaves through the Islamic world and beyond. It proves that Islamic movements can seize state power even against heavily armed opponents. It demonstrates that religious authority can mobilize populations more effectively than secular nationalism. It establishes a model, however controversial among other Muslims, of governance based explicitly on Islamic law interpreted by religious scholars. The strategic implications continue decades later. Iran uses its revolutionary ideology to build influence among Shia populations across the Middle East in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen. It supports movements that challenge Western interests and Saudi influence. Despite severe economic sanctions, military limitations, and international isolation, Iran maintains significant regional influence through ideological export and strategic alliances. This is asymmetric power perfected. Iran cannot match American or Saudi military spending, but through Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, support for Assad in Syria, and backing for Houthis in Yemen, Iran projects influence across the Middle East at relatively low cost. Religious ideology, strategic patience, and willingness to operate through proxies multiply limited resources into substantial regional impact. The complex relationship between Islamic identity and nationalism deserves attention. In the post-colonial period, many Muslim-majority nations initially emphasized secular nationalism, Arab nationalism, Turkish nationalism, Indonesian nationalism. These movements promised modernization and strength through unity based on ethnicity or language rather than religion. Most secular nationalist projects disappointed. Arab unity remained rhetorical rather than real. Economic development often failed to deliver prosperity. Authoritarian governments justified repression in nationalism's name. Disillusionment with secular nationalism created space for Islamic movements, offering different vision: unity based on faith, governance based on Sharia, identity rooted in religious community rather than nation-state. This Islamic revival is not simple return to the past. Modern Islamic movements use contemporary technology, social media, satellite television, digital networks to spread their message. They engage with modern political systems, fielding candidates in elections, forming parties, governing cities and nations. They adapt Islamic principles to contemporary challenges while claiming authentic connection to Islamic tradition. The strategic calculation behind many Islamic movements involves recognition that religious identity can mobilize support more effectively than secular alternatives. In societies where national borders were drawn by colonial powers without regard for local identities, where secular nationalism failed to deliver promised prosperity, Islamic identity offers alternative source of unity and purpose that transcends arbitrary state boundaries. Yet Islam's diversity means different movements pursue different strategies. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt advocates gradual Islamic transformation through social services and political participation. Salafi movements emphasize strict religious observance and often reject democratic politics. Jihadist groups pursue violent confrontation with perceived enemies of Islam. Sufi orders maintain spiritual focus, while often supporting moderate political engagement. This diversity is itself strategically significant. Islamic movements can adapt to different contexts, trying various approaches to achieving influence. When one strategy fails in one location, others succeed elsewhere. The lack of centralized religious authority in Sunni Islam, no equivalent to the Catholic Pope, means Islamic political movements can evolve independently, learning from each other's successes and failures. The challenge of Muslim minorities in non-Muslim majority countries creates additional strategic dimensions. Perhaps a third of the world's Muslims live as minorities in nations where they must navigate between maintaining Islamic identity and integrating into societies with different dominant cultures. These minority populations increasingly influence their host nations' foreign policies. Muslim communities in Europe, North America, and elsewhere vote, lobby, and advocate on issues affecting Islamic nations. They cannot dictate policy, but they make political costs for policies perceived as anti-Islamic. A European government considering Middle East policy must now account for Muslim voters' reactions in ways unnecessary a generation ago. This is demographic power translated into political influence. The strategic implications for tomorrow's world are profound. As global power shifts from Western dominance toward multipolarity, Islamic nations and movements will play increasingly important roles. Muslim-majority nations control crucial energy resources, occupy strategic geography, connecting Europe, Africa, and Asia, and represent substantial military and economic power. Turkey controls access between the Mediterranean and Black Seas. Egypt controls the Suez Canal. The Gulf states control massive oil reserves and sovereign wealth funds. Pakistan possesses nuclear weapons. Indonesia is the world's fourth most populous nation, with a growing economy. These are not minor players but significant powers whose cooperation or opposition affects global outcomes. The demographic trends suggest increasing Islamic influence. By 2050, Muslims may constitute 30% of the world's population, with particularly large populations in strategically important regions. Economic development in Muslim-majority nations uneven, but real is creating middle classes with resources and aspirations. Educational improvements are producing larger numbers of Muslims with technical skills and advanced degrees. Consider how the playing field has changed since 1920, when European powers seemed permanently dominant and Islamic civilization appeared exhausted. Oil wealth has created sovereign wealth funds managing trillions of dollars. Islamic finance has developed alternative economic infrastructure. Muslim-majority nations have acquired modern militaries, nuclear weapons, and technological capabilities. Muslim minorities in Western nations have achieved political influence. Most importantly, Muslims have maintained religious and cultural identity despite a century of pressure towards secularization and westernization. The predictions that modernization would inevitably mean abandoning Islamic identity have proven false. Muslims are finding ways to be modern while remaining Muslim, to engage with global systems while maintaining distinct values, to adopt useful technologies and methods while preserving religious commitment. This is the ultimate strategic success survival, not just of political power or economic influence, but of civilizational identity. Islam endures not as museum artifact, but as living faith shaping the lives of nearly 2 billion people, influencing the politics of dozens of nations, and offering alternative visions of how societies might organize themselves. The future trajectory remains uncertain. Islamic nations face serious challenges: authoritarian governance, economic inequality, sectarian conflict, terrorism committed in Islam's name, struggles to balance tradition with modernity. These challenges are real and consequential, but they are challenges of active, dynamic civilizations rather than death throes of dying culture. In the grand sweep of history, from Muhammad's mission in 7th century Arabia to today's multipolar world, Islam demonstrates extraordinary resilience. It has survived conquest and fragmentation, adapted to changing conditions without losing core identity, and repeatedly returned to global prominence after periods of weakness. The strategic patterns established over 14 centuries adaptation, while maintaining identity, learning from enemies, turning conquerors into converts, building power through trade and ideas as well as military force, continue to operate in contemporary forms. The story that began with a merchant receiving revelations in a cave, that continued through caliphates and empires, through golden ages and catastrophic defeats, through colonial subordination and modern resurgence, is not finished. Islam remains a major force in global affairs, and likely will continue as such for the foreseeable future. The ultimate lesson is that civilizations are more resilient than they appear, that decline is often temporary rather than permanent, and that strategic thinking and adaptability can overcome even catastrophic setbacks. The Islamic world's journey from Arabian Peninsula to global power, through fragmentation and reconsolidation, defeat and resurgence, provides hope that history is not predetermined, that human agency, strategic vision, and cultural vitality can shape outcomes even against seemingly overwhelming odds. This is a story worth knowing, not just for understanding the past, but for comprehending the world we inhabit today and the future that is taking shape before us.